Welcome to Crossroads Consulting, XR Insights with Jeff and Billy Rhodes. Good afternoon. We help businesses outsource, grow, and protect their assets. Today, we're going to be speaking with Matt Laffey. Jeff, I'm going to let you introduce Matt since you've known him a lot longer than I have. But welcome, Matt. We look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Exactly. Matt, you and I met, about 15 years ago at one of the Association for Corporate Growth convention. That's the Global Private Equity Association. And we've gotten to know each other well over the years. I'm fascinated with your work. It's very technical. With that being said, I would like to dive a little bit deeper into your background because I do find it to be unique in the financial world, and some of the things that we're going to talk about will piggyback very nicely on knowing your background as much as you feel comfortable giving us.
Okay. Well, again, thanks for the time. I hope you're not getting an echo, but I'm thrilled to always talk with you, Jeff. Again, we've known each other 20 years. And, both as friends and professional colleagues, and I've worked with you and I've enjoyed all of it. I started professional life 20 years, 30 years now, 40 years now ago as a banker in Atlanta, and spent about 2 years in the bank. Didn't really see myself as a banker, but everybody I had met spent some time in banking. So I started and saw a lot of different ways people are making a living as a banker. And after 2 years, I went to work for one of my clients. I became CFO of a slaughterhouse, which is about as far from banking as you can get. And it's only been weirder and stranger since then. I have, for most of the past 40 years, I've been probably a working CFO is the best title. But in addition to operating roles, I've spent time as an investment banker, as a partner in private equity firms, as a turnaround practitioner, taking companies through bankruptcy. I've worked in a lot of basic industry, basic manufacturing, service business, logistics businesses. It's been a very interesting and strange and encompassing, 40 years where, probably close to 100 businesses I've been involved in, either as an operating role, a consulting role, or in a capital markets role. So I've seen a lot, which, is why I'm this old and have this little hair. But it's been very interesting, especially going into my first role. What was interesting, two things really in the meat industry that are kind of somewhat unique, that have helped throughout the rest of the career. One was that everything you learned in school was completely useless in the meat industry from a accounting and finance standpoint, right? And in school, they teach you accounting along the lines of building something and taking a bill of materials and adding it together and manufacturing an output. In the slaughter industry, you do the exact opposite. You buy one thing and cut up the pieces and sell the pieces. And the accounting for that doesn't exist, so you kind of have to make it up. And so I started looking at numbers and flow of product a little differently than everything I was taught in school. And the other thing about the meat industry, that at least as far as traditional bricks and mortar industries, it moves faster than anything else we have. I mean, we had inventory that would change value 3 times a day. So when something moves that quickly, it forces a certain discipline on you to understand your numbers and understand them quickly. And every other industry has seemed much slower by comparison since then. So that emphasis on speed has been valuable throughout my career.
Yeah, that's what's intriguing to me about your background. The things that you've done, you don't get this kind of schooling in the classroom. There's so much to real life and dealing with personalities, dealing with the nuances of business ownership. You're probably one of those people that just never stops learning.
Yeah. Yeah, I realize how much I don't know. And every time I get into a new business or new industry, it's a steep learning curve. It's always brand new to me. I always recognize that the people I'm going in to work with know more about the industry and know more about their jobs than I ever will. And so you kind of appreciate just how broad and deep our economy is, and nobody knows all of it. I tell people all the time when they talk about financial expertise, if they start talking about technology, I'm like, that's not my thing, right? I'm not a technology guy. That's a whole separate discipline that that I didn't come through. I kind of deal with basic industry, and that's a deep and broad pool. And so it gives you an appreciation for how deep our economy is. That being said, right, you get to a certain point in life, and they call it, I guess, the value of experience, where you start running across the same problems in maybe a different industry, or something that looks familiar. You may not know the answer, but you recognize the problem and maybe how to attack it. And so over the last decade or so, I've found more and more that all the various things I've done tend to recycle in somewhat different forms. So it's been a very interesting and challenging ride, and every assignment is a new opportunity to learn. So
Sure.
Be
Sure.
open to that.
So what are the typical objectives you're asked to achieve, when a group brings you in?
Well, it really depends on the situation. I've kind of gravitated into situations where the organization is undergoing or preparing for some change. Now, that can be a turnaround situation where the business is preparing to go under and seeing if it can be saved or has to go through a bankruptcy. It can be raising capital. It can be getting ready for a sale of the business. It can be after an acquisition where it was just purchased by a new owner and they want to put in new systems or new dynamics. So it's been nice because people have an inherent, objection to change. And it's obviously, you can only, in my experience, people can only absorb a certain rate of change. And that's an important thing to gauge when you're in a company. But when you do go into a situation where, if it is, say, distressed or turnaround situation, there's a mandate to get things done. People realize we have to change. And so, or new ownership comes in, people realize things are going to change. So it's been nice to at least go into situations where you can, you have a mandate to improve something, move it forward, make it work better, because there's something just happened or about to happen that are forcing people's hands to realize, hey, we can't just do things the same way anymore. We have to look at things different or measure things different or try something different.
Right.
So,
right.
It's been a range of situations, but always where the business for some reason has to go some, fundamental change in order to move forward.
Yeah. So we've both been through a lot of corporate change, especially the industry that we're in, which is one of the reasons why we are where we are today. What is it like being parachuted into these companies? I mean, that there's going to be change. You're probably not going to be the most favorite person, or are you the favorite person that comes in? What's it like?
Well, you have to be, first and foremost, I think you've got to be able to absorb tremendous amounts of data, and just kind of swim through it and realize you're not going to absorb everything. And so, as you swim through new data, new jargon, you got to try and figure out what are the most critical parts of that data that you need to really pay attention to. So obviously, just being able to process a lot of data fast, that's been helpful. And it's easy to get overwhelmed by a new situation. But once you've been through it a lot, then you kind of get used to having to swim. It's coming. You're going to have to acclimate, and so it makes it a little easier to handle. The other thing is, as I said, going forward with an organization and trying to push it to change, people can only move at a certain comfort level to affect change. And if you push certain people too fast, they will break, or the organization will break. And that's something to get an early feel for, as to how willing are people to try new things or adopt new things, or, consider a new voice. I think part of it is to go in and recognize, again, and admit how much you don't know. And that makes people a little more accommodating to let you ask questions or probe around issues. Just because, again, you explain to them you're trying to learn the industry and you need their help. One of the great lessons I learned about 2 decades ago, I was working with a CEO who was about 10 years older than me, very, very experienced manufacturing fellow. And he knew manufacturing floor better than anybody I've ever worked with. And it was great to watch him in meetings admit all the things he didn't know. When it came to a systems or a technology issue or a market issue or customer issue, he admitted freely and openly to his people, I don't know that. I know we need to fix it, and I know I don't know how to do that. So we have to find somebody who can. And to watch people just react to a very powerful man, their leader, their boss, admitting what he doesn't know. One, it just exuded that he had a certain confidence in his abilities. And two, when he asked you something that he did know, you knew he knew it very well. So you couldn't pull the wool over his eyes on the stuff he knew. And that was a great lesson to go in and just admit that you don't have all the answers. And I often tell people at the beginning of an assignment, I have no idea what I'm going to do. I make this up as I go.
So do you have to tread lightly from a culture perspective? Obviously, there's key employees, and you got to retain them, because that could create additional challenges, especially with a company that needs to make changes. Either they're doing well, but they've hit a barrier. They're not growing anymore, and they need to, or there's a company in distress and they need to make cuts. So how does the culture play into your objectives?
Well, again, part of it is truly situational based, right? If it's a bad situation that's under distress, and if the business is bleeding and dying, right, you have to take a much harder approach and a faster approach to making change. And at that point, culture kind of takes a back seat, right? But even in those situations, you've got to be aware of who's on the team, who's eager to try something new. I will say this, that in a lot of situations, I'm often surprised by, and there's always, half of the population that's resistant to change, but I think half the population is open to change and often is looking for new leadership or looking for new ideas or looking for a different direction. And so I think in one of the first things you'll figure out talking with people in the company is who is looking for new and better ways to do things and who doesn't want to change. And so I think you have to figure out what side of that spectrum do people fall on. And then the point you made is, okay, within that spectrum, there can be key employees on both sides of that, right? Key employees who want to change and do things a new way, and other folks who don't want to do things any different, but are absolutely key and critical to, critical to the operation. And so, at a certain point, you have to decide who are the key critical employees and make sure that you bring them along. And if there are folks who are not critical to the operation and they don't want to change, that will resolve itself over time.
So I might be getting a little ahead of ourselves, Jeff, but how are you introduced? Like when somebody likes to bring you in, how do they tell the rest of the company, or do they know? Or how does that process look like?
It depends. In turnaround situations, I've been introduced at some point by lenders, which is always a somewhat odd introduction because you're working for the company, but you were introduced by the lenders, so you can't be seen as the enemy. A lot of times I'm just referred in by people I've worked with in the past. And, so coming in from a trusted referral standpoint obviously adds a lot. Often, if you're coming in to fix a finance function or set up a finance system, it is a little daunting for people. But as I've often come in, not necessarily as a full-time employee or a full-time hire, but a consultant or an interim CFO or a turnaround person. People often I've found, will trust an outsider who comes in with no agenda, with no baggage, no favorites, no cliquish awareness of what the little fiefdoms are in a company. And I've often learned a lot from employees just because they think, oh, this is somebody from the outside that I can confide in. And I think part of that is just, again, approaching people and trying to be as humble as you can in a new situation and being very honest with people in a new situation. And then they realize that this person came in from the outside and they're genuinely interested in trying to make this organization work better. So I'll end up hearing things that probably if I had been their boss for a year, they wouldn't tell me. So the newness of it is sometimes it's an obstacle, but sometimes it's refreshing. Again, a new set of eyes, a new set of questions. That's that people often find that refreshing. And some people don't. Some people just refuse to part with information. Some people try and hoard it and will not tell you purposely, critical facts that, you should know. But you get a feel for those folks, I think, pretty well too, about, they didn't tell us the full answer. So again, it's just a lot of time with a lot of people. But again, I will say too, I've often found some of the most helpful people are the folks lowest on the organizational rung of the ladder. So there's good people everywhere in an organization. And I think just if you're straightforward with folks and you approach them in a humble way, you'll often find a lot of information and a lot of help in areas you least expect it.
Knowing you over the years and knowing that you've worked in a lot of different capacities, you're not the typical CFO or bean counter. You communicate very well with people. You have those personality traits that people do gravitate towards. Is that part of becoming an operating partner? And obviously, being an operating partner, you're doing a lot more than just CFO work.
Well, I think part of it is the CFO role has really kind of two tracks. One is a lot of the internal issues of making a company operate well, function well, have the right information, systems, data, financials, obviously. And most folks come to the CFO role through that internal track, where they're very data-driven. They're maybe not as people-centric because they spend more of their time with data. So they come through that kind of internal accounting track. And I never did. I'm not a CPA. I've become a good accountant just by practice, but I'm not a CPA. I started off as a lender. So I represented that external part of the CFO role where you have to communicate the inner workings of a business to capital providers, to shareholders, to risk managers, to external constituents. And very few people, I think, come to the CFO role from that external part of the job. And so I came in probably a little less data-driven, a little less systems-driven. I've had to learn all that stuff, train myself on those things more so than if I had come in through that internal track. And so that's just the nature of how people reach that role is, are you coming at it predominantly from a data direction or from a people direction where you start? And, starting off, I was in a couple of sales roles early in my career. So, that's probably been a little bit helpful too, to come to the role that way and be forced to learn the technical parts of the job rather than, have the experience on the technical side and have to learn the people parts of the job.
Yeah.
I will
want to cut you off, Jeff, there real quick, but what's an example of the size of companies you're working with? I mean, do you have small, mid, large?
I have worked with everything from startup firms to companies doing $500 million in business a year. For me, the main issue is that, I like working in companies that have a relatively small management team. so that 4 or 5 people can sit around a room and make a decision and walk out the door and start implementing it. And sometimes that's small companies, sometimes it's $500 million. Sometimes small companies don't have that, and they run like big institutions. So it's been a range of size, really, from startup to solid mid-market firms that are, scaled enough that they could become public if they wanted.
Yeah.
Very good.
We were talking a while ago about a company that you were working in, and we were talking about the financial components, KPIs, key metrics, and you said something to me that has really stuck in my mind and resonated, that a lot of businesses don't focus on, and that's revenue per employee, cash flow per employee, profit per employee. Can you expand on that and tell us why those items are important, at least in your world?
Yeah, and that's like that. Actually, that kind of focus and emphasis has been the last couple of years as I've sat in the private equity chair and had to look at many businesses and decide which ones do you want to pursue an investment in and which ones don't you want to pursue. And I was looking at 2 businesses, and they both produced about $3 million in cash a year, and one did it across 5 locations with 250 or 300 employees, and one did it in 1 location with 17 employees, and
Wow.
completely different businesses. But now ask yourself, which would I rather own and manage, right?
Yeah.
And I guess it's an awareness that there's only so many hours in a day when you're managing a business. And at the executive level, that means managing other people. So you start thinking about the dynamics of those 2 businesses, all else being equal, I'd rather manage 17 people to produce $3 million of cash flow than 300 people across 5 locations. And if I want to grow either of those businesses, well, in the smaller business, I can spend a lot of time and money trying to find the proper employee number 18 to add to that group. And since then, I've come, and as I think everybody has learned these last couple of years, everybody needs good employees. And a lot of firms are constrained by the fact that their industries are not grooming new employees in a lot of basic industry. And I saw something that the labor market really just reached an inflection point before COVID. COVID threw it off whack a little bit, threw it out of whack. But long term, that there are more job openings than there are employees. And that's likely to continue because of the demographics. And so I'm really looking forward, as the constraint for growth on all businesses is good employees. You need to find people who think, who solve problems, who take initiative, and you need to try and fill your company with those people, and they are tough to find. And when you find them, you better hold on to them, because I think that's going to be really a growth constraint for every industry going forward, and unlike anything we've had for the last several decades.
Yeah, so I want to stay on this subject of revenue per employee, because you said something to me that a lot of businesses really don't focus on. They're looking at the P&L statements, the balance sheets, and other financials, but they don't typically look at revenue per employee, cash flow per employee, profit per employee. How do you communicate some of these things to the ownership?
Well, and I'm doing some work now with a healthcare provider that has practitioners that are tough to come by in a major metropolitan area. And as we broke out the revenue by those practitioners, some practitioners are, generating $200,000 in billings a year, and some are generating $1 million in billings a year. Now, again, different lines of business, that's fine, but there's a certain kind of gravity that is going to inevitably pull everybody back down to earth. That if you're generating 200,000 of revenue for your company and they're paying you 100,000 in salaries and benefits, and then they have to pay for their overhead and their materials out of that $200,000, there's a real limit on what you're going to be able to earn if that's the comfort zone you're going to stay in, of generating 200,000 in revenue for the company. And if that employee decides, well, that fellow over there, makes twice what I do. Well, he produces 5 times the value you do. So understand, if you want to kind of move up the ladder, you have to change what you're willing to do to produce a different output, right? $200,000 a year of revenue is great, but it's also going to cap how much value you have. And that's somewhat sometimes a hard message to deliver to people, but it's honest and it's true. And if they have a problem with that sort of honesty, then maybe that's somebody who needs to find another industry or find another opportunity where, an owner's not going to be focused on that hard truth of, producing a certain amount of value is how we all get compensated, right? So I think that it's a good tool to have with employees. And it's not just the guys earning $100,000 a year or more. I had that conversation 30 years ago with a guy packing byproducts in the meat industry, that no matter how good an employee he was, his output was worth $15 an hour. And that if he wanted to earn more money, we needed to train him to do some other jobs around the plant that were more valuable. And he understood that and was willing to do it. And, if the guy producing $15 of meat byproducts an hour can understand that, everybody can.
So when you look at a company, their efficiency of operations, they can be very inefficient. Costs are overrunning, and that kind of ties into the revenue per employee, right? You're looking at, well, this company really isn't very efficient because their numbers per employee should be better.
Well, I don't know that you can come up with a broad cross the industry dynamic. Now, within an industry segment, it's nice if you can find comparatively what similar firms do, right, and look at their revenue size.
Right.
And I think if you get that sort of competitive information from somebody in your industry, then it's helpful. And then you have to look at how do they organize the work, right? Within any business, there's a certain amount of people who are going to produce revenue with the customer or the patient or whoever it's going to be, but their activity directly produces revenue. And then it's the support, the admin team that support those folks and keep them out in front of the customers, or producing the job or building the equipment or whatever it is that generates revenue dollars. And I think if your revenue per employee is wildly out of whack with your peers, then you have to look at the organized flow of work and how do we get more revenue producers or wrench turners or patient seers and maximize the time in front of our customers and make our back offices flow with fewer folks involved in the back office. And so that's where you try and, as an executive, your job is to kind of streamline the overhead and try and find the most efficient way to use people and technology and processes so that more of your employees can produce revenue. And it's interesting because I've had this conversation now too. If you can get a business model where most of your people are producing output that turns into revenue, it's important. It's easy for folks when they're in cost-cutting mode to try and cut people. And I think that's exactly backwards, right? If your business and your business model is properly aligned, people are really the fuel, right? The labor coming in to produce that revenue is the fuel. And if you're looking to grow or fix a business, maybe you shouldn't cut people. Maybe you should add the people who are producing that revenue. And the labor is seen as a cost. And I really kind of see labor as, if it's applied in the right spot, as the energy and the fuel that grow the business. And so that's an interesting distinction that I've come to appreciate the last few years as well, too.
Interesting.
Now, do you get involved with the compensation plans to incentivize these people to, especially if you're in the production arena, minimizing waste? Because, you walk into a lot of these production firms, and there's just a lot of waste, and they could be so much more efficient and make more money, and the employees can earn more money if they just knew how to minimize that waste.
Yeah. And it's funny. I've never spent any time, but I did take one walk through a cosmetics factory years ago. And the waste in a cosmetics factory is through the roof because most of the value and the cost in cosmetics is the packaging and the marketing. It's actually not the cosmetics. And I thought, oh, if I were in the cosmetics industry, I'd just get a food guy to come run the plant, cut out all this waste, and we'd make money that way too. But as to the point on incentives, yes, first of all, let's go back and say there is no perfect incentive plan, right? Doesn't exist. If anybody had found it, they would have published it and been rich. So no perfect incentive exists. But that being said, we just, as a matter of fact, I just walked through with a company last week how to incent their people. It came down to, we started with keeping it as simple as possible, which was a sales-based incentive. But then as we talked about it, we're like, well, there are really two factors that our people can, if they put their mind to it, can help us improve. They can help us improve revenue if we can kind of concentrate them on spending more time in front of clients. And the cost of our materials is an area that we're probably not as efficient. So we introduced a concept from my manufacturing days, materials margin, which is simply the margin between the cost of my variable materials, my variable inputs, and my revenue. And we're going to incent the team as a whole on improving the material margin from the same quarter last year. So two ways to do that: increase sales, decrease our material costs. Those are the two big levers. And so we have one number, material margin, that's easy to measure, that's very transparent to everybody. They don't have to become accountants to learn that number. If they can help move those two big levers, that's most of the business. So that will get us where we need to be without going into the minutia of profit computations or making people accountants or having a complex system to measure it. I've found that incentives need to be as simple as possible. I found that they need to be easy to measure. I've often told people too that if you want to incentivize somebody on a number, you have to spend 6 months developing the number and publishing the number and refining the number, so that people come to accept whatever the number is that you're measuring, that it's correct and accurate every week, and then incentivize them on it. If you throw a number out there and start incentivizing them on it, you're going to argue about the number.
Right. Do you need the HR group, whether they are fully loaded in HR or very limited in HR, but the whole idea behind the HR side of it, does that need to be contributing to revenue? What I'm getting at is, if everybody understands what the goals of the company are, everybody needs to contribute to the revenue. Am I right or am I wrong on that?
I think when I started as a CFO, my first time, I thought that this was a data exercise, that if I could figure out where we made money and lost money, if I could get the numbers right, we'd do more of the things that made us money and less of the things that lost us money, and we'd be okay. And so I thought it was 85% data and 15% strategy. And I've since come to learn that the CFO role is about 30% data, 60 to 65% dealing with people, and 5% strategy. So people are absolutely mission critical to the role of management and where you spend your time. And you need to, as part of that, managing people, you need to educate folks on what drives the company. And again, going back to the incentives side, I don't need to make everybody a finance person, but certain things like revenue, absolutely, people need to be aware of that. And people need to understand, what drives revenue and the role everybody plays in it. I have a client I've been working with for 10 years, and we put in an employee stock ownership program, and the employees now own part of the company, and they're doing very, very well after a couple of years. And we're about to show the employees how, when the size of the revenue has doubled, that the holdings of their stock ownership has quadrupled in size. So we're going to tie a very distinct line between revenue and what's in your account.
So I'm glad you brought.
Well, while not everybody there is the traditional revenue producer, not everybody is a salesman. They don't really have salesmen. They have mechanics. Not everybody is a mechanic. So even the administrative people that, work in the parts room and, in the accounting functions, they need to understand that revenue drives your personal pocketbook. And so when our customers happen to come in and tour the facility, thank them. Extend your hand and thank them for their business. How impressed are they when everybody that they meet walking through their supplier thanks them for their business? When you go out on a mobile sales call, you represent the company. Present yourself well. Everybody you meet out there is potential referral source for more business. Anything anybody can do to impress a customer leads to more business, and that helps everybody directly. Now, that's a nice, unique case because the employees do own the firm, so it's easy to tie that line between sales and their personal wallets, but the same dynamic holds regardless of what the ownership structure is.
So that brings me to the question, because I was going to ask this before you mentioned the employee stock owned. Is there certain data that you provide these employees a little bit more detailed when you're trying to drive home, a message of, revenue and waste and all that? I'm sure it is with an employee stock owned company that you want to share that information because they're owners. But I mean, in a regular company, is that an important play?
More and more folks are coming to embrace open book management. There's always danger in that. True, there is. You don't necessarily need to have everybody see every number. So it is a careful balancing act of what you share with people. I think you do need to share, though, with your top managers, results of the firm. You need to at least share kind of the sales and the margin figures that people look at. And I've also found that, sharing information doesn't necessarily mean opening the books fully to everybody, but just being able to track an operation and measure an operation. I've found that if you have a measuring stick that the company uses, or a measuring tool, rather, stick's a bad term, but a measuring tool where you say, this is how we did this week or this month, and it's shared with people. Having a certain person responsible for a certain number or a certain metric that is tracked and shared puts them in the spotlight and drives accountability. And I've found that when you share a measurement that somebody's responsible for, that measurement improves just because they know it's being watched, and it's being watched by their peers. One of the things we did in a company in Atlanta, we had field supervisors who would manage job sites and drive revenue. And we posted every week how much revenue each person did. We posted just silly little awards every week for the top 3 producers, gold, silver, bronze medals. It jumped around. I mean, every week was widely variable. So everybody would jump around and spend some time on the medal stand, but it created a certain competition and camaraderie and jealousy about who gets the medal stand this week and who has not been on the medal stand for a while. And so having that data and having that data open to peers as well, I find very helpful. And there's always some people who don't like being measured. There's some folks who may not like their results posted in a somewhat public forum. That tells you more so about those people, I think, than the measurements. Every team that I've been a part of, if it's got good team members, everybody who is, worthy to be out there fighting it every day likes a scorecard.
Hey, let's turn the page to the exit strategy. You've been involved in a lot of exits. You've helped businesses prepare for the exit, and that's something I want to touch on right now. Give us some insights on preparing for an exit, because the buyer may not necessarily be private equity. It could be strategic. It could be family. But what are some of the nuggets that you would help a company in that preparing or that preparation for exit?
Well, a couple of things. One, the exit run more refined, involved, detailed. It's becoming a real arduous process to go through the volumes of information and data that a buyer, sophisticated buyer of any size, is going to look for or ask for. So it really is an exercise that if a company is thinking about an exit or a transition of ownership, they need to start thinking at least a year in advance, maybe two, and start gathering that information, organizing it, being able and ready to provide it. And I think that there is so much they don't know about your business. What you consider standard common knowledge is not. You have to explain it to somebody. I go into situations now where I've never been in the industry for, and people mention a name, and okay, they mentioned a name. Is that a customer? Is that a vendor? Is that an employee? Is that a supplier? Is it a competitor? I don't know. And I have to often slow people down and say, hey, you've got to explain this to me. We often, too, I will start a business, a process of reporting financial information and describing what happened, and put them through that exercise on an ongoing basis, just to prepare for the day when you want to tell that story. In that ESOP company I mentioned earlier, we started preparing quarterly reports. We started doing shareholder letters, even though we only had one shareholder. We had no audience. We did it anyway. And years later, when we decided, well, we're not going to sell the business to the outsider, we're going to sell the business to the employees. Well, we don't need to explain it to them. They know this business. They're the ones doing it. But we did need to explain it to an ESOP independent valuation firm to set a value. They had to understand the business. They had to read all those reports and say, oh, well, here's the value of this business because now we understand it. So there's always going to be an audience for that story. You just have to get ready to start telling the story long before it's time to go to market and start telling the story. So on the private equity side of the business, once a private equity buys a firm, the first thing they start doing is, we may hold it for 5 years, but we're going to start working on that exit story now. And we're going to have 5 years of data, or at least 4.5 good years of data when time comes to sell that business. So it's a very complex process. It's tremendously data driven these days. And you need to explain your business to somebody who has never seen it before, knows nothing about it. And that's the story you have to tell. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of work.
Yeah, and the private equity buyer, they need to move quickly, because you mentioned 5 years. They typically hold companies 3 to 7 years, but that could change. They could go earlier, they could go later. But I guess if you're selling to a private equity firm, just be prepared to move fast versus a strategic acquirer, or are they same?
Well, and of course, there are two very different types of buyers. Private equity firms, unless they are already specialized in your industry, you have to be educated in every part of your industry. One of the nice things when we, early in my career, were selling our meat processing business, we sold it to one of the best buyers in the industry. And it was interesting, as we went through the due diligence, we would bring other, a number of people through in the industry and outside of the industry, and they would ask lots of questions and ask for lots of data. The best operator in the country came in and they asked 3 questions about the business, and they were the 3 correct questions. And they said, if we give them the proper answers, then they're interested, because they knew the business very, very well. Yeah. They knew how to run our type of business. And these questions they asked dealt with where we sat in our specific market. And they realized if that was a good position to be in geographically, they didn't need to know how we ran the plant. And the hidden message there was they have people who can run our plant if we can't do it. So they don't necessarily need us to run our plant because they run a plant better than we do. So yes, a very different due diligence process, a very different buyer. And they focused on what the relevant answers or what the relevant questions were.
Yeah, the involvement of private equity in business today is enormous, and we hear all the time that they've got just an unbelievable amount of dry powder, cash that needs to be deployed in excess of $1 trillion. What do you see the influence of private equity now versus, I don't know, 20 years ago?
I think private equity is a little oversaturated. It's evolved quickly, and again, a lot of money has gone into it. And so private equity is now looking in areas that, it maybe didn't years ago. It's to some degree desperate to put that capital to work. Again, they've been given that capital with a mandate to get it invested. You can see no matter where you are in this country, you have probably seen a number of subscription-based car wash services pop up in your community because private equity decided they wanted to be in that model. Well, the first guy probably was a nice strategy, but since then, I think we have enough car washes, but still keep popping up. So, and that within that said, private equity, that term encompasses a broad range of buyers, folks that came out of an industry, made money in that industry, are now reinvesting in that industry because they know it. And I kind of consider those, strategic partners who have a private equity fund versus true, just pure financial folks who raised a fund and are now investing it. Two very different types of private equity firms. They ask different questions. And obviously, if somebody knows an industry well, they're going to ask better questions. Again, as our potential buyer came in and asked the 3 correct questions. It was a very quick process, and they put a price on the table after answering 3 questions. So very different community. I would say within private equity, it's like dating. You can date any number of people, but the person you marry better be the right person. It can be a fantastic partnership if you marry the right private equity partner. It can be a marriage that ends in an ugly divorce if you entertain the wrong one.
Staying with the private equity side, and I don't want to keep you much longer, Matt. This is one of those interviews that we go into series 2, series 3. Private equity is investing pretty much everything these days. You're seeing consolidation in a lot of different industries. The skilled trades, HVAC, plumbing, electrical, hot items. You're seeing consolidation in the insurance industry, local firms, wealth management. Is that something that at least skilled trade guys should take into consideration? And how is that likely to change the way they've run their business?
I think, you have to think about it, even if you're not considering it, simply because your competitors might be. And you might suddenly, if you're in a trade that wasn't traditionally a private equity, marketplace, but now they're deciding that they like your space. If they're not in your neighborhood, they might be soon as your competitor and might be able to compete at a different level than you can because they've got a balance sheet that can handle it, or they are managing to buy supplies at a far cheaper scale or market and advertising beyond what you can do. And so it's something that I think you've got to pay attention to if it's something that's starting to show up in your industry. People are selling to these big consolidators. A couple of things just in general about the private equity model. In general, I think in general it is very positive for the economy and for our system because there are statistics that show that private equity businesses grow faster than privately held ones that don't have an equity sponsor. They create more jobs. The old cautionary tale about, they're going to come in and gut the company couldn't be more wrong. Private equity doesn't want to gut a company. They want to grow a company. They want to take a company from 30 million in sales to 60 million in sales to 90 million in sales. And so they're going to create jobs. They're going to make investments. They're going to get that mandate for growth. And they do have a mandate for growth, right? They're not going to be happy if, we did 30 million this year and it's provides a nice lifestyle, for the owner, and we'll be happy to do 32 million next year. No, that's not going to do it, right? They want to go from 30 to 35 to 42 to $50 million. Yeah. That focus on growth, that's good for us, good for the economy as a whole. So the private equity model, I think, is vastly and wildly poorly reported in the press. It's good for the economy. That being said, on a micro level, some private equity firms really don't have a good operating plan. They just try and get scale and sell scale, right? By piecing one and one together. They're hoping that 3 looks better to whoever they might sell to. But that doesn't mean that they've done a good job of integrating operations to be a coherent business. So, the overall private equity model works. It works well, and there's been some fantastic success stories in it. But there have also been some disasters. Like anything else, I don't think you can paint it with a broad brush and paint an accurate description.
So around here, you can tell the companies that have been purchased by a private equity firm, their marketing budget gets increased, tenfold. They're offering better wages, better benefits, and all that. Which kind of leads us to a nice little segue into what Jeff and I do with the professional employer organization that I know that we've worked on some, accounts with you on. That economies of scale allows the smaller companies to compete. And I just wanted to get your input on, how you value a PEO and what it can do for some companies.
Again, that's a topic that's worth its own discussion, right?
Yeah.
That could go for hours, but I guess looking at the PEO model, I see several things. One, there's the employee view of it, which generally is, we have a deeper benefit package, or we have more choice of health plans. Instead of 1, we have a choice of 3 or 4 or 5. So employees often like the model because it provides them better benefits. And that ties back to what I said earlier about keeping good employees, that's the constraint on growth. And so the employee perspective then is good. And as an employer, keeping those employees happy, keeping them retained, knowing that you can offer a benefit package that's maybe better than the Fortune 500 company down the street. That's a big plus. The employer perspective, obviously the focus is on costs and, hey, can we do this and maybe pay less than we're paying now, or get more for the same price? Because again, instead of going to the market with our 30 or 50 or 100 lives, the PEO is banding us together with their 300,000 or 400,000 lives and going to buy and scale. So hopefully, if the economics work, the employer sees the benefits. For me, as being in the CFO role or trying to guide a company towards an exit transaction, the biggest thing that I don't think is talked about is that transfer of risk, right? All of those employment issues, compliance, regulatory issues. When you go to try and sell a company or do a transaction and you get that due diligence list and there's a page of HR issues, and all of those are with a PEO structure handed off to the PEO, and they've complied with all those things. That's huge to getting a transaction done.
You there?
Yep.
Hey, we've had some rough weather today, and just got knocked off. So we can do an edit, a stop start. So
Okay.
Let's go back to the when Billy was asking you the PEO question, and just from there.
Yeah, and we don't have to go too long. We
Right.
can do another series on it, but
But just mentioning the PEO side of it,
Again, it's kind of the three perspectives of the PEO. The employee side is ideally you get a deeper benefit package, maybe with more options, bells and whistles you didn't have before. So the employee tends to like it. Again, once you get people past the change of trying something new, but employees like it. And of course, from a standpoint of trying to keep those employees, to the point I raised earlier about retaining good people, it certainly helps to offer a benefit package that's better than anybody else has in the marketplace. From the employer perspective, it's nice if the economics work that it can save you money, because the PEO is going out to the market with hundreds of thousands of lives when they're buying and structuring benefit packages. So you get those economies of scale that can pass down to you and save you money. My perspective has always been really on the transaction side when trying to drive a company to a transaction. All of the employment risks and compliance issues and potential headaches and obstacles to a deal get handed off to the PEO, who has got people on staff to file taxes, comply with government regulations and reporting and unemployment, and all of those headaches on a due diligence list under employee issues can hand off. It makes doing a transaction so much better, and scaling a business, right? It's one of the things that buyers look for. Can we scale this? Well, with a PEO structure, it's easier to add employees, maybe in new markets where you don't know what the insurance market or the network is. Having a PEO structure is fantastic. One of my clients now is potentially had discussions with an overseas firm that would like to buy them. And think about that. If you're looking to invest in another country, the thing that scares me the most is, what employment law am I going to walk into that I don't know about? So to have a PEO structure in place where all of that compliance and regulatory issues are handled, that makes it so much easier for a foreign buyer to invest and say, oh, okay, you have experts handling all of the employment issues. I don't need to worry about those. I just like the business.
Have you, I'm sure in your days, you've had to deal with the challenges of running a business, the HR risks side of it. How significant can that be?
Significant. Again, I think 65% of the job and in kind of the finance role is handling people. But specifically when you dive into all the various things across the CFO or CEO's desk, the employment issues and the health and the benefits are stuff that we just don't know, and we have to learn, right? It's outside the scope. Again, they don't teach you any of that in school. You go to school for a finance degree, you don't learn about employee benefits. So you're kind of forced into learning and getting up to speed on all of those issues when it comes to regulatory and tax and benefit dynamics. And so it's really the part of the job that I dislike the most, because it is outside of my comfort zone and I don't want to know about it, but I have to. So it is to be able, again, that's where PEO structure is nice, to be able to come in and hand it off to an expert, right? It's like having a good CPA who's a tax guru. I don't want to be the tax expert, because every time they change the tax law, I got to relearn it. I like having somebody who is staying up to date on all those changes, a phone call away. Lets me do what I need to do without having to read up on the latest tax changes. So it's like any other discipline where you need an expert who focuses on it all day, every day.
Well, that's excellent, Matt. We certainly appreciate that feedback. We've taken up about an hour of your time, so we can maybe touch on that at a later date.
Okay.
But thank you very much. It was very insightful. We appreciate you joining Crossroads XR Insights. Thank you, Matt.
Well, I always learn something when I talk with you guys as well, so I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.